Hello, Alex here again. Now, this may seem like yet another off-topic video for those of you who are just know me from this channel, but if you're a follower of my blog or some of the work that I've done before that, you know that I mostly deal with recording technology, digital signal processing, guitar tech, that type of thing. And that's not one of the kind of blogs that tries to help you convince your significant other that a Neumann U87 is a totally great bargain for a home recording studio. It's more about taking like Scotch tape and popsicle sticks plus whatever gear you have lying around and making a decent sounding recording out of it and demystifying mojo and jargon and that sort of thing. Now, fortunately for the regular video channel viewers, I did actually have a order from RoboDig and a few other places come in, so I will be able to get a couple of 3D printing tech related videos out this week. But I do have a wife that's home sick in the other room on a conference call right now trying to sneeze her way through it. So I can't do any big loud experiments right now. So for those of you here for the first time, brought in by microphone stuff, welcome, and feel free to check out some of my other tech videos and expand your horizons a bit. If you want more music related stuff, there's a link to my blog in the video description below. And without further ado, using Scotch tape and popsicle sticks to make a decent sounding recording. So for those of you not in the know, this is the venerable Shure SM57, which engineers the world over for decades have had a love-hate relationship with. Now this microphone is a low-impedance cardioid dynamic microphone made by Shure Corporation and commonly used in sound enforcement, and it was first brought to my attention as a kid when I saw it in the Head Like a Hole video by 9 Inch Nails, and I thought, what is that strange man singing into? And by that strange man, I mean, of course, Trent Reznor. Now, this is 90s floppy-haired skinny Trent Reznor, not all-grown-up Oscar-winning Trent Reznor, who could definitely crush you with his biceps, because he is using a Beta 58 since he's making that money. But regardless, the 57 has been used on countless tens of thousands of vocal recordings and hundreds of thousands of guitar recordings, and it's actually been on a few albums, just about the only mic that they used at all. It's useful enough to the point where it's started the adage, when in doubt, toss 57 on it. But we're not talking about that award-winning mic from Shure that can also double as a billy club in a pinch. We are talking about the ZRAMO, Professional Moving Coil Dynamic Cardioid Unidirectional Vocal Handheld Microphone, which I guess is also a professional instrument microphone, which I guess makes sense if it's supposed to be a 57 clone because it has shown up in some very high-profile areas as a vocal mic. Now this particular clone has also shown up as the Wamick WM57, as well as the Pile Pro Professional Moving Coil Dynamic Unidirectional Cardioid Mic, and a few other things. And to give a little peek into history, these kind of flooded the eBay market a few years back, where people were finding out that the SM57s they were paying like 50 to 80 bucks for were in fact fake, leading an entire generation of budding engineers who were trying to save 20 bucks or so on these mics to say, why would anyone record with these? These are shrill and they sound like crap. Yeah, bruh, is totally fake source. So bearing in mind the reaction to the clones as well as the $8 price tag, do I think this is actually going to sound like a 57? Well, in short, no. And in long, no. Now here's what little I could find at all regarding the specs. Looking at that, it seems 57-like if these are to be trusted at all. Kind of suspect is the output impedance, which they list at 300 ohms and actually measures at 572, where an actual 57 is much lower than that, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The mic arrived in this kind of nondescript cardboard box, and laying it next to a regular 57, dimension-wise, it looks pretty similar. You could see how somebody who wasn't used to handling a real 57 would, you know, be fooled by the thing. So now we're going to get to where the difference in that output impedance comes from. If we pop them open and lay them side by side, we can see that on the left we have the regular Shure 57, on the right we have our ZRAMO mic with no output transformer at all. That would explain the low cost, and it would explain the difference in the output impedance. Now we get to the second big difference, which is the grill. This is from a regular 57, and side by side you can see that they are very similar, at least cosmetically, but the regular 57 is held on by this little retaining snap clip, whereas the ZRAMO is just kind of glued on there. Now, looking inside the capsule from the bottom, this piece of plastic is called the resonator plate or the resonance plate, and we can see that on the ZRAMO, the holes are a lot bigger. Now I'm going to take out a pair of calipers and measure exactly how much that is. That'll be useful later. Here's the front grille of the clone, and compare that to the 57, we see that they're actually not too far off, at least on the outside. But our third big difference is going to be the actual diaphragm itself. Here's what the clone diaphragm looks like, and you can see it's fairly smooth, whereas this is what a genuine SM57 diaphragm looks like. Much difference. And with much of the character of the mic coming from the diaphragm, of course, I expect that to play a role in our tests in the future. Now, I don't have access to an anechoic chamber, so I can't do exact measurements, so I thought I would dig up as much as I could as far as test specs, and this is what I could find. It's a little bit more accurate than the actual Shure SM57 specs right here, which are octave smooth to the point of not being particularly useful, but I overlaid an actual recording of an SM57 on top of that just to give you an idea what those squiggles might look like. So now let's get down to the nitty-gritty, tie our super scientific rig together, and do a few noise measurements. Do they look the same? Well, no, of course not. The red is our clone, and the green is our regular SM57. This was just a sine sweep from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, and you can see the difference right here. We have much more peakiness in our clone mic, and a much more subdued low end, as well as some gaps in the mids. Now we're going to switch to some noise tests, and we're going to increase the smoothing to 1/3 of an octave. Again, with the red being the clone mic. This is near. This is far, as in about 2 feet away. And then this is the off-axis response at a medium distance, about 1 foot away. Now, it's quite obvious without even listening to this that this is going to be a very different sounding mic. So let's go ahead and say a couple Harvard phrases into both of the mics at the same time, and then I'll pan back and forth between them so you can hear the difference. We talked at the sideshow in the circus. We talked at the sideshow in the circus. Used a pencil to write the first draft. Used a pencil to write the first draft. He ran halfway to the hardware store. He ran halfway to the hardware store. The clock struck to mark the third period. The clock struck to mark the third period. A small creek cut across the field. A small creek cut across the field. So you can see it's not a terrible sounding mic, but it is definitely not a 57, and it is quite a bit more thin and raspy, and even peakier than a 57, which is known as kind of a peaky mic to begin with. We're missing a decent deal of the lows, which isn't that big a deal because we can make that up with EQ and proximity effect, but the big thing is these peaks and the highs. We have this strange 9K peak, and then our presence peak is much more pronounced than it is in a 57. As it is, it kind of sounds like a caricature of a 57. So comparing these, the clone versus 57, the clone has more highs, more presence, scooped mids, less bass, it's peakier, and our off-axis 45-degree response favors the highs and lows, which makes it a little bit even more scooped sounding. Now, is that usable as it is? Well, maybe. If you're using vocals with thick foam screen and a lot of proximity effect, it could work okay. If you have a particularly low voice with like overwhelming bass response, it might work okay. Or if you're using it as an instrument mic and you favor something that's a little bit brighter and more present with subdued lows, that might work. But would I say it sounds objectively good? No. No, I wouldn't. But that actually makes me happy because now we can take our $8 mic and just do whatever we want to and see what happens. So first thing we're going to try is impedance loading. So a bit of history. All of these Shure dynamic mics, well, most of them, are descendants from the original Unidyne mic, unidirectional cardioid microphone from the 30s. And they came in originally 3 different impedance levels. And as you can see from these ancient data sheets, you were actually supposed to use a microphone transformer to present it with the proper loading effects on the capsule when you were hooking it up to a higher impedance input, with the prescribed impedances of the intended circuit being right here. Now, if you look at our model 55B, which is our medium-ish, where our regular 57 falls, we see that they intended it to be loaded with 200 to 250 ohms or so, with anything above that being, quote, high impedance. Now, that's old-timey high impedance. That's not new school high impedance. 100K is not enough for an instrument pickup unless you're using active pickups, which is one of the things that really annoys me about this old-timey terminology being slung around these days, but I digress. Now, modern preamps tend to fall into the range of like 1.5K to 2.2K. We don't use the old school telephony 600 ohms inputs anymore. And then some of the cheaper microphone preamps, like, from Behringer and other budget companies like that, tend to be around line level for the microphone inputs. So they'll be around like 10K, 15K, something like that. So people have found that loading a Unidyne descendant mic, like 300 ohms or 600 ohms or so, actually improves the sound of it quite a bit. Now, this has some to do with the actual transformer that's in the 57, because we are going to be damping some of those peaks a little bit and loading it properly. But when we're talking about our SM7B, which uses a very similar Unidyne capsule, that's a transformerless mic, and its sound is also greatly improved by loading it properly. So that gives us a bit of hope there for our poor little $8 mic. Now, any transformerless mic that's not using a electronically balanced circuit is going to have a very low common mode noise reduction, or CMRR, which means the longer the cable run, the more risk you have of picking up noise along the way. So just bear that in mind. But it's not a hopeless situation because, like I said, our SM7B is also transformerless. So let's go ahead and apply a load to this. We're going to do it the cheap and cheesy way. Now, I'm going to use 10K ohm input mixer for this, just a cheapy mixer to kind of simulate what the average person might have. We're going to pull our capsule out and just put a resistor across the terminals to give it a proper load. But Alex, I hear you employ, tell me, did it work? Well, it did something. This is before loading. Again, our clone is the red. And this is after loading. Now I'm going to pan back and forth between so you can see the difference as we go back and forth between a loaded and unloaded. We've definitely done something to the peakiness. Our low end is a little bit more well behaved, and our high end is actually a little bit less peaky, but actually it's made it look a little bit more like what Shure thinks the SM58 looks like, at least on paper. Or change the upper contour to look more like an SM7B with the presence boost circuit in, kind of, or like a Shure Beta 57, which is a lie because it absolutely does not sound like a 57, and it's just a way to cash in on somebody who wants 57 but fancier, but I digress. But wait, we have to try something else. Now, if you look right here, a lot of our peakiness is way up in the high frequencies here. So what if we just replace the grill with a genuine 57 grill and see if that resonance is affected by that? So since I have this 57 on the table, I'm just going to pop the grill off and throw it on our cheapy mic. Now, never, ever, ever try this at home. Inside here is our diaphragm, and it has tiny little hair-thin magnet wires that you will most definitely break off if you disturb the utterly crappy glue that Shure uses to keep these diaphragms onto the capsule with. In theory, you can fix it, and I have fixed it in the past, but in practice, usually you're out like another $50-$60 to get a replacement capsule. But regardless, since I did risk taking this off, let's go ahead and measure the difference in the hole diameter on our resonance plate just to give us a little more bang for our risk. So here's our clone, and then here's our regular 57. Now, it's not a huge difference, but scribbling those down, it's about 15%-ish. We're talking 4.8 millimeters to one versus 4.1 millimeters to the other. And they also have a slightly different depth, which could be significant considering how close we are to the capsule. And here's our clone with the regular 57 put on it. So all right, let's see if this is a viable mod. Well, if you look at our blue, that's our stock cheapo, and the orange is the cheapo with the 57 grill, the green, of course, being our reference, which is regular 57. We definitely did something. Now, if you look at these three large peaks up here in the highs, we tamed the one in the middle a little bit, but we kind of made the higher resonance worse. And our overall shape seems a little bit less 57-ish. So maybe they had the right idea going to larger diameter holes. Now, this is something I'd like to try in the future, 3D printing a couple different resonance plates and seeing what difference hole diameters and number of holes can make. But this is supposed to be a quickie video, so I didn't get to that. So in our list of mods, that makes two kind of strikes. So now what do we do? Well, here's something that we can just try because we have it right in front of us. Remember, our regular 57 has that transformer and our other does not. So we're going to do a reverse TapeOp mod. Now the TapeOp mod is where you take a 57 and pull the transformer out of it. And what that does is it extends the highs and the lows, it mellows and it smooths the mids, which means it makes for a different and somewhat better in some circumstances sounding microphone at the expense of losing a little bit of gain and probably picking up a little bit of extra noise because you don't have that transformer balanced output circuit. We also lose a touch of peakiness in the presence, and it gives a 57 a character a little bit more like an SM7B, which is a mic that's favored by both broadcasters and death metal vocalists, like this guy who happens to have been my boss at one point in time, and you thought your boss was scary. So we're just going to swap the genuine 57 entire bottom half of the microphone that has a transformer in it over to our clone and see what happens. Now I don't expect this reverse TapeOp mod to do what we want at all, but since the parts were all lying there, I figured, hey, why don't we try it and see what happens? Now, theoretically, it should sound like poo because we are just exaggerating those negative characteristics of the cheap microphone to begin with by putting the transformer back in it, but let's just go ahead and see what happens. And as you can see, yeah, it did pretty much exactly what we can expect, and it does indeed sound like liquid poo. So we'll just go ahead and add that to our nope list. Loading the capsule did a little, but not much. Smaller resonator holes definitely changed the character, but not in a way that we particularly wanted. And adding a genuine Shure 57 transformer did the opposite of what we were looking for. So it's starting to look a little bit grim. But wait. If we're saying that we can fix our low-end problems with just sitting a little bit closer to the mic, then the problem we're having is our high-end. Because we've already said the contour of the EQ curve looks halfway decent except for that strange peakiness up at 9K, so we just have to shave like 6 dB off the top and see what happens. And we know that our transformerless SM7B mic with our Unidyne type capsule uses a passive EQ in the body of the microphone after the capsule to kind of give it different characters. So what if there were just a way that we could sort of EQ the top off of this before it hits our mic preamp and see what happens? Which means now it's time for envelope math. So let's talk about our simplest EQ circuit. It's just the RC filter, resistor capacitor filter, which means we have a resistor in series and then a capacitor in shunt to ground, and we take our signal off the junction of those two. Now we're going to get our minus 3 dB point at 1 over 2 pi RC, 2 pi resistance capacitance. Now we are using a single-ended circuit, so we don't have a transformer, but if this were a balanced circuit, you could do it just like this, and it just requires an extra resistor. However, if we look at this little grid that I'm going to draw here, and we assume that each of these is a decrement of 3 decibels, and then 4 of these bars represents 1 octave of range, then because of this type of filter, our slope is going to go downward forever at a rate of minus 6 decibels per octave. Now that's not necessarily what we want because we will continue to lose top end the higher the frequencies go. We want a little stair step instead like this, which we can actually do fairly easily by adding a resistor below our capacitor between it and ground to increase the impedance at particular frequencies. So let's give that a try. Now all we're going to be doing is making a high shelf filter that has a minus 3 dB point of around 2 to 3K. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it there. And we're feeding somewhere between a 2.2 kilo ohm and 14 kilo ohm preamp impedance. Now we want our output impedance of our circuit to be less than 1/10 of the input impedance so that we don't get strange loading effects on our EQ curve, which means we're going to use a 220 ohm feeding resistance. Now this is ignoring the capsule output resistance for now. And then I'm just going to guesstimate a starting value of 2 times feeding impedance for our shunt resistor. That's the one that's going between capacitor and ground. And you could always make that variable to make this a variable EQ. Now we can plug that into our equation. We already know the 220R is there, and 470 is the closest to 220 times 2 for common values, and that's going to dictate what capacitor we want. So around 0.27 microfarads. I don't think I have one of those, but I do have a value slightly below and slightly above, so I'm just going to use these cheapy tantalum capacitors to test it out and just see what happens. And as far as the capacitors, if you're doing this along at home and you want to do something decent, tantalum caps are okay-ish when there's no DC on them. Film caps are much better, but they're much bigger, so you might have a problem fitting them in there unless you can find some nice small ones. Ceramic capacitors, they can be microphonic, so you want to not use those if you can, and you want to avoid electrolytics if you can, because they are both nonlinear and they will dry out eventually. Might take a few decades, but eventually they will dry out. So in the spirit of duct tape and popsicle sticks, I'm just going to use some of this speaker cable that I dumpster dive and wire up our little circuit here. And while we're at it, since I have to put this back together anyway, and I want to give my 57 back its grill, I'm going to take this heat gun, I'm going to heat up the grill of our cheapy mic a little bit and replace the really crappy foam that's inside with some decent acoustic foam. Now, acoustic foam is really any open cell poly foam with a density that's above 1 and below like 3 pounds a square foot. So this is fairly lightweight stuff at 1.2 pounds a square foot. And I'm just going to stuff that in here after trimming it to like roughly a round shape, as you can see. And then I'm going to glue it into place. Now, our regular 57 doesn't have any foam up in the actual grill part, just in this bottom plastic section, but I'm going to take our cheapy little filter and I'm going to stick it in the grill here just in case that like 9K zip is a little bit of a resonance from the chamber up here. It's a long shot. And I'm going to use E6000 flexible adhesive to put it together and then tack that on with a couple drops of super glue just because it takes the E6000 so long to dry. And with a little bit of finagling, I said a little bit of finagling. There we go. Capsule's in place. And since, again, this grill is just glued onto the body, I'm also going to use the E6000 flexible adhesive to hold that onto there as well. It has a little bit of residue from the old glue. I didn't bother cleaning that off there. Make sure that you're not dripping any onto the diaphragm, and then just press it into place. Boom. There we go. All right, Mr. Etsy, enough of the arts and crafts. Did it work? Heck yeah, it worked. The EQ circuit actually mellowed this out quite a bit, if you could see up top here. Our lows match relatively, and the only thing we have is this little scoop in the mid-range, which may or may not be a bad thing. Now, to kind of torture test our proximity response and that high-end zip, I'm going to take this full-range aluminum driver and put the mics right up on it, and that's going to give us kind of more of like a smiley face EQ curve. And as you can see, again, with the modded mic being in red, this is noise that's sitting in my desk in regular recording position with typical proximity effects. And we've evened it out so that even though they're not identical, they are within 2 decibels-ish of each other, which is not bad at all. Now let's go back and do yet another voice comparison with our mod versus our regular 57. These samples are all recorded with no EQ or effects, and the distance is about like 10 inches away from the mic.
Testing 1 2, test 1 2 3. Testing 1 2, test 1 2 3. Testing 1 2, test 1 2 3. Testing 1 2, test 1 2 3.
So when all's said and done, it can sound kind of 57-ish. Actually, after I recorded those voice samples, it sounded more to me like an Audix i5, which is kind of like a slightly flatter, wider, scoopier 57, and I just so happened to have several on a shelf behind me, so I did a couple of noise tests there, and you can see that, yeah, it kind of looks like an i5. I don't know if it looks more like an i5 than a 57, but the similarities are definitely there. I mean, I guess this mic kind of sits in that space right between those two now. But bear in mind that after a couple mods, we're talking like very close comparisons of a mic that's 10 times cheaper. So in conclusion, $8 mic plus foam plus a few passives equals a decent sound. Now, I wouldn't go ahead and throw out all your Neumanns, but it's definitely a lot better sounding than some of the other budget options that we have lying around out there. Plus, I worked many moons on and off as a live sound engineer, and I can tell you, it would be nice to have something like this when you're in a situation where the band is definitely probably going to steal your microphones, which got so bad to the point in one club I was working in where I just stopped putting out decent OM5 mics and started putting out these cheapy $15 or $20 mics. But getting away from live stuff, let's say you already have a decent multi-track setup and you wanted to record like gaming session podcasts with your friends. Well, you can afford to buy 12 of these mics for the price of just one of the others. Now that's not to discount other cheap mics out there. These Nady SP5s can be gotten for 15 or 20 bucks, and they're a little bit bright and harsh, but they're still pretty decent sounding. And for you podcasters out there, this will give you an opportunity, instead of just running out and buying like whatever USB mic they suggested, to get like a regular old preamp, which has slightly more pro features like, effects inserts, so you can run a compressor limiter so that when you're yelling versus whispering, you're not freaking distorting your mic and driving me crazy while I'm trying to listen to your podcast. So anyway, at the end of the day, not bad. Not a 57, not an i5, but not bad. Actually, I thought it had enough potential that I went ahead and I ordered a couple more. Yay. And do I think this microphone, after being modded, is going to be useful for actual critical recording? Well, you've been listening to me talk through it this whole time. Trolled. So thanks for watching the video. Gold star if you made it this far. If you're into this type of stuff, go ahead and subscribe. And I always have my support links in the video descriptions below. Until the next video, get out there and make something awesome. Or get out there and record something awesome with a cheapy $8 mic that you modded all by your very lonesome. See ya.